Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to be talking about how to select a quantitative methodology. This is part of our Dissertation 101 series, where we look at topics that we think that every doctoral student should know about, and prospective doctoral students who want to look at the road ahead and understand the tasks that they have to be able to plan appropriately. That is where this comes from. This series began as a result of student requests that we do webinars on more dissertation related topics. So if there's a topic that we haven't covered already that you are interested in, please ask and we're happy to help. So with no further ado, let's dive forward. So here's our basic order of business today. We're going to start with talking about some key terminology. Then we'll talk specifically about what a quantitative methodology is, as opposed to qualitative or mixed methods. We'll look at some specific quantitative methods, approaches, or designs, as they're variously called, talk about quantitative data collection, and we'll finish with a look at how to select an approach based on topics that you suggest. So I always encourage students to share about what you are doing, what you're working on in terms of research, where your interests are, because we can use those as examples and you can see more things that are relevant and of interest to you. I've been doing this for years. I can talk about stuff for hours, but that's not nearly as helpful as you're hearing something that is of interest to you that you want. All right, so let's review some key terminology. Those of you who were here for the qualitative webinar, don't worry, we'll get to new information first. But let's differentiate between a couple things. There are interview questions, survey questions, prompts, where you're posing specific tasks, statements, or questions to people who are participating in your research to get data from them. There are also research questionnaires, which are prepared instruments or sets of questions that are developed for a particular topic. And this can be as short as 1 or 2 questions. This could be as long as hundreds. As an example, there is a short 2-question and prompt that is used at the start of many medical appointments as part of the pre-screening to determine what to talk about. And it asks simply in 2 questions, and how do you feel today? And do you have any suicidal ideations? And that questionnaire, it may seem very simple or trivial or odd, but it's there because it was found to be strongly predictive of this, and replaced a much longer questionnaire that people would just not fill out because it was so annoying, they thought. So research questionnaires that have been prepared, used, and validated are a important part of many researchers' arsenal, especially when doing quantitative research. And then research questions as opposed to research questionnaires. These are the larger questions that your research is designed to answer, things that you need to collect data and do some sort of analysis to arrive at the answer. So this is going to be more than, well, 150 people said this. It's going to be, well, okay, do they strongly suggest that, or is it overwhelming majority, other things like that. All right, so we also want to differentiate between action research and pure research. Action research is something that's designed to help address some sort of problem or issue. You've identified a need or a gap. And pure research is more interested in, well, just describe what's going on. And my own doctoral dissertation was in the vein of pure research. PhD dissertations that are doing pure basic research tend to be much longer than action research ones because it's more open-ended. And the action research are more directed towards, here's an action we want to be able to do afterwards, or here's something we want to evaluate, does this work? Now, as a whole, the research design that you select is going to be a function of what questions you're trying to answer of what type or types of evidence you need to answer these questions. How can you get the data? Can you get the data? And is this something that is previously collected and published, previously collected but not published, or not collected or published? And we also want to differentiate between what is more specifically called the methodology, sometimes called the research design, but more specifically called the methodology, versus something that is also sometimes called methodology, but would more specifically be our methods, approach, and design. So methodology is the highest level. You have quantitative, we're dealing with things that can be counted or reduced to numbers in some sense. Qualitative, where it's impressions and probably valuing the exact wording that people are using, even if it's different. And mixed methods, which is a combination of the two. Now, before you select a methodology, there's some recommended steps that can save you a lot of extra trouble. First, to just do a brief review to refamiliarize yourself, because a lot of people, they take their research methods class and then they have other classes, so they're not thinking about it. But reminding yourself of, okay, so here are the advantages and here are the disadvantages of each approach, and how does it align with what I want to do? And then as you select your methodology, to then zero in on the more specific type, the approach or design that you are considering using. It's a good idea to review some prior literature on the topic to see what's been done already and how you want to align your study with that. And are you addressing a broad research gap or a specific one? Because the broader you're going, that will inform the kinds of information that you're trying to look at. So for example, if you're trying to address a broad thing like, say, CEO compensation in the United States, you probably want to have a larger pool of places that you're getting the data from, whether that's getting published industry statistics, whether it's taking public company data, whether it's interviewing more CEOs, perhaps, or surveying them. You also want to ask, is that practical? If I'm doing a study of executive compensation, having interviews with 120 with 120 CEOs, that's both a lot of time and also a lot of CEOs to get to agree. Now, if you're asking them to fill out a survey, well, it will probably be faster for them to fill out the survey than do an interview with you. They might not be willing to do it, versus if you sit them down to coffee. And then also there's a question of how many do you need? So before you select a methodology, I think it's also helpful to assess your relative comfort level. And you can certainly look at Creswell's seminal introduction to research, but I think it's helpful to look at recent literature as well and see what do you read that catches your attention, that you're like, yes, I would like to do this, or I'm interested in the same kind of information. And you can take that, you can discuss it with faculty and look at recently published literature and see what they've done related to this, including making an appointment with our research librarians to help identify that literature. So let's talk about quantitative research a bit. Something to keep in mind, if you have the Creswell book, at the end of most chapters, there's a list of advanced research sources. You really don't need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to come up with a whole new method. If you're aligning your work to build on or replicate or follow up on previous research, that's very helpful. And if you're not comfortable with the particular methodology, you can go looking for recommendations on recent literature to see, oh, yes, they used this survey. Here are the statistical analysis techniques that they used. Oh, well, I can probably use those myself. And when you're writing your chapter 3, it's great to justify, oh, yes, this has been used with this is the things I use, therefore I'm doing the same thing. Here are a couple of resources that you can look at. And of course, when you are collecting data, you always want to keep in mind participant privacy and protection. Anytime you're dealing with human subject research, you want to be in contact with the IRB, even if you're pretty sure it's going to be exempt from review. You want them to say that, so you've done your due diligence. And also, you want to make sure that you are keeping your data in a protected fashion and that you're not having personally identifiable information that might, if say your computer was stolen, might compromise their privacy. All right, so let's talk about quantitative research a bit. Now, you could describe it as quantitative research being essentially about collecting numerical data to explain a particular phenomenon. And that's not a bad way to start. If we look at this extract here from that same source, if we take a pragmatic approach to research methods, the main question we need to answer is, what kind of questions are best answered using quantitative as opposed to qualitative methods? So if you want to know why people do things, and you have qualitative research out there that, someone went and interviewed a bunch of people and collected a list of here are the 25 things they say the most, then that's a good time to take that information, make a survey, and then go and get lots of people to fill it out to get quantitative data on that, because the prior qualitative research has given you an idea of which questions to ask. Now, if it's something where that hasn't done yet and you don't know which questions to ask yet, then you probably don't want to be using quantitative, and you want to do qualitative first. So as the author expands, there are 4 main types of research questions that quantitative research excels at answering. The first is when it's something that involves counting, like how many students choose to study something, or how many math teachers do we need, or what is the most common staffing level, for example. Now, if you're looking at trends, you want to say, okay, we're planning for a school district, how many people should we hire based on current trends and current information? That's the kind of thing. We're dealing specifically with numbers, so again, absolutely quantitative. Now, in terms of what factors will help you hire people, well, that's something where if you're wondering what brought people here already, you could certainly do a survey about that. If you're trying to figure out what prospective applicants want, you could again do a survey. But if you're less sure if those things are applicable to your situation, you might end up doing what's called a validation round first, where you do kind of some pilot version, and then you look at the results and say, okay, did this show the things we looked for? Do we need to change what we're asking people? And the last one here is when you're looking at a hypothesis. You believe that something might work in a certain way and you want to test it. And having statistics say, okay, yeah, a strong majority of people said this, or this is the most important factor determining X, that really does come down to numbers. So within the larger stream of quantitative research, you can divide it a couple different ways, but I'm going to propose the easiest one to understand is to start with experimental versus non-experimental. Are you trying to control something and see, okay, if this is changed, what effect does it have? That's going to be experimental. It's you are manipulating variables. But if besides recruiting people for your study in the first place, if you're not trying to control something, then we might typify that as being on the non-experimental descriptive end, where you're observing things, but you're not changing. And if you are doing some changing, but you're not randomly assigning the participants, you end up somewhere in the middle with quasi-experimental. One of the things you'll find when reading about quantitative research approaches is that a lot of different disciplines will subdivide this based on the most common things in the field, is you might see, oh, here's a list of the 6 main types of quantitative research. Another list that has 4. Now, experimental and non-experimental will almost always be on those lists, but you might have someone breaking out survey research as a separate category and other people saying, well, that is really a type of non-experimental research. So another question that you might ask are the things that you're manipulating and observing, are they both important and meaningful? Which gets us to the, okay, will this generate data that will answer the questions? And are you answering questions that are important and worthy of study? Are they going to help address a problem or allow something to happen that wouldn't happen otherwise? So some of the benefits of selecting a quantitative methodology is that it's very focused on facts and things that you can verify. It usually doesn't require direct observation, although there's a subfield where you do go in and count things, or you count the things that people do on a video. Generally faster to replicate. And with many research designs, it's going to have greater participant anonymity because you don't even need to interact directly with someone. And it's generally considered to be more generalizable, which means applicable to a broader set of situations, broader population, and to be more valid. And so quantitative research ends up being very good for evaluating and testing hypotheses and models because we test it by doing statistical analyses of the responses. Now, it does have some limitations, including it tends to be intimidating to many early researchers. Interviewing, I sit down, I ask people questions. It's familiar enough, but a lot of people haven't administered a survey or wonder, how do I select an appropriate one? Not saying it can't be overcome, but that is a common limitation that turns people off. It also tends to require an understanding of statistical analysis techniques. Now, so long as you have a basic understanding of how to proceed, the fact that you may not have used SPSS since the training class is not a deal breaker. But if that applies to you, you're probably going to want to do some review and potentially work with someone who will assist with the statistical analysis, which is very common. So don't at all feel that it's untoward or it represents a weakness. We all have our strengths. Some people will hire an editor to help them get their references spruced up or fix their grammar. Some people will work with a statistician. And if you're planning on doing it, then you can outline that in your research methods chapters. This is something I plan to do. And there are actually cases where when people are working cooperatively with a research site, where there's an in-house database person or statistician who assists with that. So it need not be someone that you are hiring. Sometimes you have a professional partner who is also interested in the success of the project and who volunteers their expertise there. It is very possible for quantitative research to focus on incorrect details. In the earlier webinar, brought up an example where I was asking questions about compensation. And if you just ask someone, hey, would you be happy if you got an iPhone from work? People generally say yes, who doesn't like free stuff? But if you're trying to figure out what kind of compensation will make people stick around, it'd be helpful to also ask questions like, well, would you rather have an iPhone or would you rather have money? And other things like that. I had one experience where I was talking with someone who was a business consultant, and they recounted going into a company and they were just buying people cell phones. And he said, we've always done this, as it works. We don't know why the retention is going down. And it turns out they had started buying cell phones for people when the very first iPhone came out. And iPhones are both a lot more ubiquitous and a lot generally cheaper than they were then. So they had kept doing that, but it turned out that people weren't as interested as before. So that would be focusing on the incorrect details. Now, quantitative research will usually follow qualitative research. The first step is almost always qualitative. You might do focus groups, you might do interviews, you might do case study analysis to arrive at a bunch of things that you then follow up and confirm with quantitative research. But usually the first step, and that does include things like phenomenology and grounded theory, where you're trying to explain, okay, what's going on and why. It's almost always going to be qualitative research first. Now, in a similar vein, quantitative research is great for testing hypotheses and models, but usually the hypothesis originates in that qualitative research. The model that you propose will explain things originates in qualitative research. Now, you also want to be wary of something called spurious correlations, because just because things happen to go in the same direction doesn't mean that they're actually linked. And this is coming from Tyler Viggen's wonderful, hilarious site, Spurious Correlations, where if you want to laugh at ridiculous correlation, you can go and check that out. I've selected a couple here. So, for example, you can look at the number of letters in the winning word, the word that clinches the National Spelling Bee for the year's winner, and how many letters that has, and the number of people who get killed by venomous spiders in the United States that year. There is no way that these are actually connected. But if you just look at the graphs, if you just run statistical analysis, it does kind of look like it's related. And if we're questioning the wisdom of doing that, well, on a sample of deaths as small as this, because in a 10-year period here, it's never going above 15, you're going to have a lot of variation in that anyway. So it's just not nearly large enough to get any sort of meaningful correlation. Now, if you're wondering, that correlation percentage and the R value, it's talking about how much they're going in the same direction at the same time and to the same degree. So generally a higher R is better, but again, correlation itself does not necessarily equal causation. This next one is comparing the per capita consumption of mozzarella cheese and the number of civil engineering doctorates awarded. Now, I would venture that the number of engineering doctorates going up has been going up in part because those programs have now been around longer and they're required for more jobs. And the fact that cheese is going up at the same time, cheese consumption is going up, is coincidental. So, does one drive the other? I don't think that people getting their PhD in civil engineering are eating that much cheese to drive this change by themselves. Or this other fun one, when we're comparing the number of films that Nicolas Cage appeared in a given year with the number of people who drowned in swimming pools. And we see that, when the number stays the same for 2 of those 3 years at the beginning, it's the number of drownings stays the same. When he does more movies between 2005 and 2007, the number of drownings goes up. When he does fewer from 2007 to 2008, it goes down. But is this a meaningful correlation? Well, not really. And you can look at the R equals number and see, well, that's only 66%. It's not even as good as our cheese thing here. And also, the fact that it happens to be going in the same direction, we just look at this and say, okay, that looks like it's just coincidental. There's not a plausible reason, not a clear rationale why these might influence each other. Now, if you want to read more about that and about how to avoid them, there's a Harvard Business Review article that I've included here. And let's talk about some of those general ways. You want to avoid sample bias. So, for example, I worked for a program where we had a whole cohort of about 40 students join us who are all teachers in the same school district. The same school district that had required EDDs for the highest salary grade. So they all decided, okay, well, we should get our EDDs as fast as possible. And they all signed up for the same program. And so if you were to pull the whole class, they had a lot of thoughts that were the same because they were not only from the same school district, the same county in Georgia, had almost all grown up in the South, but they'd also been teaching with the same general group of students. So they had a lot of experiences and thoughts that were the same. And if we use them as a sample, we recruit them, their convenience sample, it would be very biased. They would be slanted and not necessarily representative of another group. Multivariate analysis, where you look at more than one factor, looking at the statistical significance, and a couple of resources that are very helpful for that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are numerous divisions of quantitative methods, how you're going to be dividing it. And so here's an example from one discipline, looking at market research. Market research, doing a true experiment would be very uncommon, so they don't include it here. But you can see they broke it down to survey, retail audit, which would go in the category of document and analysis in many other fields, but more or less the same thing. Location discovery, inspection, and logistic monitoring. So these are subsets that are done enough that they're identifying it as a specific method. Another way of breaking it down: descriptive, correlational, causal, comparative, quasi-experimental versus experimental. So in this case, they're differentiating between what I lump together as non-experimental, where you're not trying to change something, saying, well, we're just documenting what's going on, for descriptive, or we're trying to find trends and what seems to be going together, correlational. And usually these will progress, just like qualitative research usually precedes quantitative. Usually the first step will be descriptive, if it hasn't been done in qualitative already. Then you look at correlational. Then you might do quasi-experimental, and then finally experimental research. And medical trials will progress with a similar sort of direction. If you're interested in that, I'm happy to say more about that, but suffice it to say that the gold standard for a late-stage clinical trial is to do what's called a randomized control trial, where one of the things is you are sorting people into different groups. It should be random sorting, but of a large enough size that you end up with groups that are roughly comparable. And then you will do double blinding. So even the people running the study on a day-to-day level, interacting with whoever it is, don't know who has gotten the real drug and who has gotten the placebo. Here's another breakdown. And so it's, in this case, it's focusing more on both types of data and how you would analyze it. So talk about quantitative data collection. Now there's multiple multiple approaches, but you can run an experiment, controlled observation. So for example, there are cases where people built these rooms with the two-way mirrors. And so you can look them through, but other people just see their own reflection, and they go and observe people and they count what do people do. Or they put like food on the table and see, okay, how many do people drink, or do people pocket the snacks and things like that. You can collect data through surveys, through a variety of means: paper, mobile phone app, web browser, survey. You can have them do a longitudinal study where you're tracking them over a long period of time and gathering all sorts of data along the way. Polls, telephone interviews, face-to-face interviews. For those of you who are familiar with the Nielsen ratings for TV, it used to be that they would call people and ask, so what were you watching? And then they'd tally all that up. And then they moved to having a data collection box that you'd have on your TV, and it would report back to them what TV you were watching. Now a lot of it is done electronically because streaming services can count more precisely whoever was doing things rather than they're just calling a small subgroup of the television watching population. And if you're wondering, well, wait, I thought face-to-face interviews were used in qualitative research. They are, but you can still ask quantitative questions in them. And it just happens to be the medium that you're collecting the information for, that you're collecting information through. You can also do documentary or record analysis, look at secondary data that people have already collected. For those of you who are doing education research, both the US Department of Education and the state level counterparts collect an awful lot of data that is available to the public that I know many students at ACU have used. And at this point, we're going to do a quick research look at how to identify different data collection instruments that people have used. And then we'll wrap up, and we'll probably be wrapping up a little bit ahead of schedule. But if you have any special requests or things you'd like me to talk about, please let me know. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my web browser. All right, you should now see I've got the ACU library portal open here. And I want to find some quantitative research. And I want specifically to look at research about surveys of teacher happiness. Now, there are a couple different ways I could code it, but for our purposes, I'm just going to write survey teacher happiness and see what that brings us up. And we have a lot of results coming here. Just as a general practice, I'm going to go ahead and set this to the last 5 years because I want to look at recent research. I only want things that are full text and also that are only from scholarly peer-reviewed journals. And just looking through here, an evaluation model. Great. That sounds like what I'm interested in here. So I'm going to go ahead and then going to open up the entry here. And I'm going to take a look at the abstract here to see what they tell me about how they did this. Now they identified 3 things, and they're talking about running statistical analysis on this, about their R correlation coefficient. So that looks like they did some sort of survey to collect data. So now I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And I'm going to look and see what they used here. So they described the model that they used. Describing the model. And so they said that here they sent a questionnaire. Now, this is it looks like a non-native English speaking author. That's fine. There's some grammatical things that don't matter. We see that they used a questionnaire to collect information here. Now, this particular one doesn't include that. That's fine. But many will, especially if it's coming from an American journal, where it's more common to include that if it hasn't been published before. So here we have an article about happiness in mathematics education. So let's take a look at the methods here. Responded to promise, in which they describe. So that looks like it's a qualitative study. So we don't even need to open up just looking at it, they responded to prompts rather than filled out questionnaires or something like that. So we might also go here and add quantitative. Now, if we look at, let's see. Okay, this one here, I'm going to take a look at it. We'll check out they did a quantitative study and they were surprised by some of the findings. So they went and did qualitative interviews with a group of 14 student teachers to try and explain some of the results that they got. So they ended up doing mixed methods, but they originally set out to do surveys before and after. So let's take a look at this piece. So you can see the interview that they used for the qualitative part. And let's see. So study procedure. And they were using a pre-created process to check their questionnaires. Let's see. So they tell us here that they did an online-based questionnaire. They had a sample here, and you can see that the teachers tended to be mostly women, and they had a relatively young average age. And if we look at this, we see that it looks like they repeated the survey. So same survey given twice, so they could compare the answers. All right. So now, if it's a previously published survey, then there should be a citation telling you where that is. If it's something the authors developed, often it's published or available as a supplement. If it's not, most researchers are happy to license it, and they'll just ask, oh, send me a link when it's published and, acknowledge me in print. So that's done a lot. There's a question in the chat. Could I talk about how to determine a delimitation and where this information should go in the prospectus? Sure. So when you are first writing up your research, you want to set some boundaries for what is in and outside of scope. And that starts really with the statement of purpose. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab a recent dissertation, and then I will show you how this is written up in different places. So just a moment as I grab that. All right, you should see my screen again. So I've gone to the ACU Digital Commons site where theses and dissertations are posted. And we have a publication here of Megan Sanders' dissertation. And let's take a look at that. So it's an EDD dissertation. And we're just going to load it right here and now. And let's look at when she starts telling us the delimitations. We're starting with looking at the abstract. So here it says the researcher implemented purposeful sampling to identify participants enrolled in the university's fully online EDD program. So short version, purposeful sampling, you go out and you recruit participants directly. In this case, I would guess that Dr. Sanders asked classmates saying, hey, would you participate in my study? And so she's telling us in the abstract. And then if we go to, oh, sorry, one other detail here in the abstract, in the university's fully online EDD program. So you can see in the first sentence here where it says online doctoral of education students at a private Christian university. So we are looking at a delimitation of the data was all being collected from students enrolled at one private Christian university. So that was a delimitation there. And now she was looking at how they perceived communication interactions with their instructors and peers. Okay. And that makes sense because if you were looking to get meaningful results about what people did to be successful and feel supported and everything like that, you would need a much larger sample if you were looking at more than one institution. Now, in terms of where that's set up here, where it's first mentioned in the chapters that might be submitted as part of the prospectus, if we see the statement of the problem here, so the general description is talking about Christian in universities in the United States. And then we'd see here, see student perspectives of their experiences in online doctoral programs at one Christian university in the United States. It's the main focus of the study. So that is telling us they were looking at one site. That is a delimitation. It's not expressed in those terms here, but that's the first place that they are talking about the delimitation in the body of the document. Now, in the purpose of the study, they say that they wanted to do this at one Christian university. I would guess by the description that it is in fact talking about ACU, but it doesn't necessarily need to be that. Although this sentence here makes me strongly suspect, again, this is at ACU. I think I remember talking with her about this one. Okay, so if you're looking at the problem, if we say the general problem is, how is it described here? That there are a lot of programs and online higher education is very unstable, and you want to know what makes a good culture. That's something where you could look at it as a multi-institutional thing, but it will be harder to have comparable things unless you can establish some clear similarities. So for example, I've taught in the EDD programs at 4 different universities, and one of them was a private university located in the upper Midwest. Another was a state university in the American South, and 2 of them were Christian universities of very similar character. And so if I was looking at those and wanting to see what are the commonalities, I could look at all 4, but I think people who are attracted to one of those Christian universities programs will probably be attracted to the other ones as well. And so if I was delimiting it to those 2, I would be able to look at what the similarities and differences are between the group. If you're delimiting it to 1, you can zero in on, okay, what are the things here that attract you, that work? So now the other places where that'll be set up here, when we look at the second chapter, it's going to be talking a little bit more about online education in general. And I think this one has a section on Christian higher education. So that reflects the delimitation. It doesn't focus on it. If you're talking specifically about delimitations in the literature review, I would have to see if this student has a literature search methods section. Let me look for that. They do not. But what you'll see in, especially in some of the more recent dissertations, they tend to have a paragraph or two that says, I looked primarily at recent literature published between, let's say, 2018 and 2023, or I looked at literature published after insert things. So for example, in the DMP program, you might see we're looking at literature published after the passage of the Affordable Care Act because of how it changed whatever it is that they're looking at. So I see there's a follow-up question about how to stop looking for new articles. Usually people will draw a line in the sand. So, and this will depend on the topic. So if you'd like to volunteer information in the chat, happy to go off that. But in general, let's say that you are looking at, we'll say, teacher retention in a given region. And you say, okay, I'm going to be looking at articles published up until this date. And it doesn't need to be right now. It could be the when you finish your coursework, or the day that you plan to finish and turn in your lit review chapter. So up until that point, you can say, all right, well, I will still look at it if it comes out, but you don't want to be doing a lot of expansion after that. So in the earlier session, we were talking about how to set up your search and how you can save different searches. Let me briefly show something there. So let's say that we're looking about let's say I do a search for these parameters, and I set up my search to be really refined to what I want. And I'm just going to slap some things together here very quickly for the sake of the example. And this is also where you will have wording in the different chapters, like at the time of the study, and the reviewed literature, which Marx is saying, okay, we're not saying that things haven't come out since while I was finishing the writing and defending, but up to the point that I outlined to you, this is what was available. So let's say we are going, let's say last 20 years here. If you're doing a particularly narrow thing, you might have a broader field here looking for something. You might find, that's more than enough. Let's make it go to the last 5 years or something. Especially if you have something where you're focusing on a professional field that's going through a lot of changes here. So if I look at this and say, okay, I have my search starting here, and I'm going to go ahead and let's see if this is working. If you sign in, shoot. Normally, you can click on sign in, and you will see what searches you have done whilst signed in. And there's actually a couple options you can select to receive automatic emails when new results for your search come in. So once you've got your perfect search, and you can certainly use the Ask a Librarian function to work with a librarian to help set that up, you can get automatic emails when new things come out. And then when you reach whatever day it is, when you're like, okay, this is when I'm not looking at new things, then in your chapter 2, let me just pop up some text here. All right, you should be seeing my screen in Word. So you might see something, the literature review was conducted between, let's say, August 1, 2022 and now, this wouldn't be the all of what you have in the literature search methods, but it does say, hey, the scope of my literature review covered up to this. And just to give you an idea of what it might look like in context, let me throw on a little bit more formatting and text. So here we have, here's when I actually did the research. And of course, obviously, you wouldn't be finding things that were published after that if you're working within that period. This is where most of you stuff you looked at went back to. And here's a geographic context for what you're searching. Now, one of those questions that comes up in many fields is, what is relevant? Now, in my own experience, I've lived in other countries. I've lived in France, and I happen to be fluent in French. So if I was writing on a topic like, oh, I'm going to bring in French sources, I would also write up in there and say, oh, yes, I looked at both French and American literature, or both French language and English language stuff focused on these countries here. But you wouldn't be, you probably wouldn't be opening it up to all things, just saying, here's where that is. And in the particular fields that I work in and publish in, there's a lot of stuff that is relevant that is published in French, which is kind of what you expect when you're a historian of French music, which I am. So if we're to come back to this and say, okay, what are some of the reasons you would want to draw the line? One is to simply finish. The other is that if you craft your general search, which does not stop you from adding things that you find elsewhere, but if you craft your general search and you have that as a saved search that will email you new articles, or that you will periodically go in and check to see what the new results are, that limits the amount of time that you might spend spinning your wheels, if you will, where you just go in and you have to look at it and see, okay, is this new? Have I read that or not? That save search will save a lot of time and makes it a lot easier to go back and see, okay, here are the exact keywords that we used. And someone else following might say, okay, well, I'm interested in something very similar, but I see from the search words that he or she used that they were primarily looking at this. And I'm also interested in that. As an example, Catherine the Great of Russia hired French composers to come to St. Petersburg and write operas. I don't study those at all, in part because I don't read Russian. Now, it happened that a Russian-speaking colleague of mine was looking at that and read someone else's dissertation and said, oh, yes. So it says here they worked in this archive. There's no mention of this library in St. Petersburg. Well, I see that I'm going to St. Petersburg to go look at that thing. And so by documenting that, it helps things out for other researchers as well, and also keeps things within the scope. So if you've delimited it to this language resources or things in these locations, and as an example, if you're doing that kind of thing today, you might have a note saying, I did not examine the sources in St. Petersburg because the State Department had an advisory preventing or discouraging Americans from traveling to Russia right now for reasons. And in some, well, one point you might say, hey, well, it would be really fun to go there. But if you were doing that, you could also say, well, actually, I don't need to spend another 6 months on that, and I don't need to travel there right now. I can finish sooner. So there are benefits for the delimitations. The temptation to get absolutely everything is high, but you can have a good, rigorous, well-researched and grounded study without getting absolutely everything ever published before that day when your dissertation is finally published and approved. Does that answer your question? Great. Well, I see that we are just past the hour, so we're going to be wrapping things up. Our next webinar this week is on Thursday. That is a live edit session, and I do believe we still have room for another volunteer or two. So if you are working on something that is dissertation related and you would like to volunteer your manuscript, just drop me an email and we'll be happy to add you to the list. With that, let me just do the normal wrap up. And if you have any questions, you can email me directly or email onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. You can go to my.acu.edu to set up an appointment and find more information and links to all of our past webinars on the Online Writing Center website. That's it. Thanks for joining us. Have a great evening.